Well, hello once again. My name is Dan-Ahlborn, and you are listening to the True Grace Podcast. This is a podcast dedicated to understanding the true meaning of grace and your identity within the new covenant of Jesus Christ. And one of the cool things about this podcast, I get to talk to awesome other believers across the nation, and today we're going to do exactly that. I have Chad Belew with me. He is the lead pastor for the Arsenal Church down in San Antonio. So if you're ever in that neck of the woods, definitely stop by. They have some pretty awesome stuff that they're doing down there. Chad will talk about that here momentarily. But he's hanging with me today, man. And brother, I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule of coordinating and talking about God's grace today, man. How are you?
Dan, first off, man, thanks so much for having me. Right before this, we were talking, you named off a couple people like Andrew-Farley and Zach Maldonado, and I saw Tracy-Levinson's been on here. I don't know how I got put in the same group as these guys, but I appreciate you giving me a shot.
Well,
and
hey,
just having a conversation.
Oh, that's awesome. No, and I mean, you come from just your name kind of popped up through that, and I'm all about connecting other grace-minded people together. I think as a community, we can do more of that and be better in that way, but also it helps us and just really helping people understand the true meaning of grace. And that's, like I said, that's the heart and soul of what God put in my heart to even create this podcast. So I appreciate it. So tell me a little bit, man. So, I mean, how did you come? I mean, this is always kind of my stock question, I guess, out of the gate, but most of us were not born into a true grace knowledge. How did you come to knowing grace, Chad?
Yeah, so you're correct. Definitely didn't grow up in this kind of understanding of the gospel. As you kind of broke down your story a few minutes ago to me, very similar. I grew up with an Assemblies of God background. My grandparents were actually missionaries to Jamaica.
Oh, wow.
I had my mom and dad were youth pastors. My mom and I'll say my real dad were youth pastors for a while, and we'll get into that. But so yeah, I grew up in the Assemblies of God. Actually felt like I was supposed to go into youth ministry. Was called into youth ministry at a fairly young age, about 13 years old. And so all I knew when I graduated high school was I'm going to an Assemblies of God school so that I can get, I can graduate, I can get licensed with the Assemblies of God, and that's the direction I'm going.
Right.
So I went to Southwestern Assemblies of God University in Waxahachie, Texas, for a couple years, but quickly figured out that I'm not very good at school, especially college, and trying to keep myself focused. I was much more interested in just talking to people and hanging out, and my GPA reflected that quite a bit. So I left and joined the Army, and we can get into some of that later. But I basically, with this understanding of kind of really with the Assemblies of God, and I still have a ton of friends and family that are part of the that denomination, and I love them, and I still do life with them.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I really kind of struggled with was that I could lose my salvation, and then the other one was a big one was losing my calling, and there's a big story there. So I got married right out of basically leaving college. Got married right before I left for the Army. We were married 5 years, had a son, and right before my second deployment, decided we weren't gonna stay married, and we filed for divorce. And I remember when I got divorced, being told that I'd lost my calling.
Oh, wow.
And that I had done something to walk away from the calling that God had on my life, and that I couldn't be used anymore. And in the denomination, if you were divorced, especially if you were remarried, you couldn't be licensed. Right.
And that's common, not just even in that denomination. There's a lot of churches, even where I was brought up, if you were divorced, that was like the cardinal sin that prevented you from serving God. And how crazy is that now, what we know? But continue on, Chad. This is good.
Yeah, that was it. I remember that, and I remember, so I deployed, went to Iraq, and had kind of a testing of faith and a a questioning of my faith while I was there. A lot of it being, seeing a war that was happening that was very kind of, the underlying problem there was religion, on multiple sides. So it was within the Islam religion, like Shia and Sunnis that were infighting, and then the way I saw it, it was Christians coming in to push their beliefs. And so I just went through this like really kind of faith struggle. What I believed, did I really believe in religion? Is this the God that I serve? And in that, start questioning, like, so when I read the Bible, especially, I mean, everybody I read, it seems like they had a past. And I remember telling God, like, you got this guy Paul that got to write most of the New Testament that was killing Christians, and I can't get a divorce.
Yeah, man.
So how does that work? And what I was so confused. And just when I got back from Iraq, really my second deployment, was going to church, but was just kind of doing it because that's what I knew. Kind of out of obligation. And we grew up in the church, so that's what you do on Sundays. You go to church, and wasn't really involved. And just through a series of events, ended up meeting, really not even, I mean, it's not by coincidence. God obviously was still pursuing me, and looking for me and letting me know, that he was still there and that he loved me. And I just had some really incredible encounters with people that just started to speak this message of grace and new covenant and the gospel. And Zach Maldonado was one of the first ones that I ran into that came to, he just started talking about Andrew-Farley and John Lynch, and started walking me through all these books and telling me that I was crazy. Nah, I'm not really crazy, but we just started, having these conversations. And then Bill Loveless, I don't know if you know Bill Loveless. He's another one here in the San Antonio area that's written a ton of like devotionals and kind of Bible study things.
Awesome.
That, man, I just started like eating this stuff up. And when I started reading what these guys and women were saying, I was like, wow, this almost sounds like good news.
Right. Yeah, man.
Like, wait a minute. God does love me. And even in my mess and through my mess and on the other side of my mess he loved me no matter what, and has stayed with me. And so it was just like you said, a long story, but constant series of events where God just kept reminding me that he loved me. And I mean, the names that you've kind of mentioned that we've talked about are, have just kind of led me in this direction. And I don't know where else to go now.
Well, I think what it comes down to, Chad, and I mean, like I said, our stories are completely relatable. I mean, change the cast of characters and a few things, but they parallel quite nicely. I think what happens is when you finally hear the good news, because it is what it is, grace is the good news, it fits, right? I think for so often we're trying to put the square peg in the round hole with just organized religion and doing the religious things to make us feel like we're appeasing God. Well, we don't need to appease God because he already took the punishment on the cross for us. And when we understand that it's finished and we can rest in that truth, and that's what grace is all about, it just feels natural. It's what it should be, and that's why we hunger for it, and that's why we crave to know more, to understand and untrain ourselves from what standardized religion is teaching us to be the truth, when really it's a lot of man-centered things that are organized in the face of Christianity to make us appear to be more godlike. But there is, once you become saved, you're 100% saved. You don't ever get less or more. You're there. You've achieved it. And through that, we live for God, or from God, I should say, not for God. So, man, that's awesome. The other thing, too, is as you're telling your story, that one song, The Reckless Love of God, that's what I was thinking about when you're telling me the story about just how God, he's reckless abandon. And sometimes people have a challenge with that. But I love the song. I love the message, because God will do whatever it takes to be near his children. And sometimes through our mess, he pulls us through that. And the last thing that I love what you said, man, is God uses imperfect people. You can't but not look back in any of the Old and New Testament of looking the men that he used to minister. By no means outside of Christ, who was God, these men had issues, but he used them to touch the lives of many. So awesome. That's awesome. What a great story, man. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. No, yeah, it's definitely my my God story, and I love like you said, I think one of the hardest things for me, and I'm still walking through it, and we'll walk through it for many years to come, I'm sure, is the tearing down of all these false beliefs and all these and I want to say lies, but I think when we say the word lie, usually it's something where somebody says it or does it purposely. I went through a time when I first started hearing this message where and just really hearing the message of grace and hearing the gospel, that I was kind of angry at people that I came up under. And I was like, how could we read this now that I'm reading, the gospels, or I'm reading Paul's letters? How can we read this and go any other direction than the direction of grace? And so I went through this, like, really kind of a frustrating time of almost being mad at the people that taught me, or that I came up under, or that were, leaders in my life. And luckily I've gotten to the point now where I'm like, man, we know what we know, and the things that we don't know, I can't hold anybody, responsible for that.
The one thing that's helped me, Chad, is I kind of dude, I've been there.
Yeah.
What's reconciled for me is, like, God had me where he had me at the time he had me. And he needed me to be at that point in time to get me where I am here today. So when I look at it that way, it doesn't upset me as much. But you're right, man. It's like when you look at it now through grace, and more importantly, the big thing with grace is context, right? The reason that many of the stuff gets bent out of shape is that we take a passage or a grouping of passages, but don't look at it in the context of the letter that it was written, specifically in these New Testament epistles. Or conversely, we're looking at the Old Covenant and trying to blend it with the New when they're two diametrically opposed. They work together, but the New ushers in something that was old and obsolete. So when we look at it through those lenses and then basically read the Bible, it becomes clear and consistent with all passages, and we don't have to try to make it fit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and I've had that conversation with people as we've walked through kind of coming to an understanding of these truths, in the same way, like you just said, where, man, I've been there, and I think, honestly, that's probably a natural reaction initially, especially if you've grown up in the church. Like, what in the world?
Right.
How did we miss this? And I love what you said, that, God had me where he had me at the time that he had me there. And I think without that, I wouldn't, I wouldn't trust and believe and maybe even appreciate grace at, the place that I'm at now.
Wow, that's good. And I love when people share their stories, because I know there's people listening to this podcast right now that can relate to us, right? Or maybe they're in the midst of this situation and they're frustrated. And I've said this a few times, but I do believe that's why a lot of people are walking away from, and I use the air quotes loosely with church, is because they see the inconsistencies. But when you see it through grace, what is the gospel of grace, it all becomes clear. Because it's not about trying and doing more. It's about resting and trusting what's already been done. God had to make a promise with himself that'll never be broken, and we can rest in that. And that is our salvation. And that, to me, gets me excited. And that's through that I want to do things that are pleasing to God. It's not out of obligation or duty or checklist, as sometimes religion makes it. It's straightly from the heart. And that's what God wants.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's now... I think the way that I see God is a heavenly Father, and is a God that I can actually trust. And before I wasn't sure that I could trust him. So I always had to kind of walk gingerly.